Was our president mere figurehead? Were powerful, unseen, and unelected interests actually steering America's future? It sounds conspiratorial, perhaps even impossible. After all, in America, an elected president couldn't simply be a puppet, could he? But what if it's already happened before? Don't forget to follow us on social media. Just search for The Michael Braa Show on Insta, Facebook, YouTube, or the KC CBS 47 Plus app. It's 1933 and America is in crisis. The Great Depression has brought the country to its knees. Banks shuttered, factories idle, millions unemployed, entire families forced into breadlines. Despair grips the nation. Hope seems distant. Into this bleak landscape steps Franklin Delano Roosevelt, promising bold, decisive action through groundbreaking New Deal. Roosevelt's message resonates deeply, pledging government support, employment programs, and sweeping financial reforms aimed squarely at helping ordinary Americans. But not everyone is convinced. To America's wealthiest and most powerful elite, bankers, industrial magnates, and the business tycoons, the New Deal spells disaster. Roosevelt's abandonment of the gold standard and massive public spending threaten their wealth, power, and the very foundations of capitalism. To them, Roosevelt isn't a savior. He's a dangerous radical steering America towards socialism and economic ruin. Fearing the worst, some influential figures begin whispering of drastic measures. Behind closed doors and in private clubs, talk of rebellion simmers. Men accustomed to power and privilege now openly discuss, and seriously, the unimaginable, overthrowing an elected American president. In this tense climate of suspicion, desperation, and class conflict, democracy itself hangs precariously in the balance. Amid this turmoil, one of America's most respected military heroes, Major General Smedley Butler, is about to be approached by representatives of this secretive circle. Their proposal is stunning, their ambition chilling. Rally 500,000 disgruntled war veterans, march on Washington, and seize control of the government, turning Roosevelt into nothing more than a powerless puppet. What Butler will do with this shocking proposal could determine the future of American democracy itself. But exactly who are these conspirators? What drives them to risk everything to maintain their grip on power? And could such audacious plot possibly succeed? Well, tonight we reveal the explosive story of America's forgotten coup, the 1933 business plot, and explore a critical question. Could a scheme so bold, so unthinkable, really happen again? At the center of this shadowy conspiracy is a man whose name may be unfamiliar to many today, but in the early 1930s, General Smedley Butler was an American legend. Born into privilege, Butler defied expectations early. At just 16, he enlists in the United States Marine Corps and quickly earns a reputation as a fearless and unwavering combat. His courage was unmatched. Butler became one of the few Americans ever awarded 2 Medals of Honor for heroism. His men revered him, not merely as a leader, but as someone who generally cared about their welfare, their lives, and their dignity. But Butler was more than just decorated warrior. After decades of service, he retired from active duty in 1931. But instead of quietly fading away, he became an outspoken critic of powerful interests he believed exploited America's military. He famously branded war as a racket, criticizing the elite who profited while ordinary soldiers suffered and died on foreign soil. To millions of veterans struggling to get through the Great Depression, Butler was more than a hero. He was a trusted voice, a champion who understood their pain and their frustration. In 1932, when thousands of desperate veterans known as the Bonus Army marched on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of wartime bonuses, Butler stood with them publicly. While other military leaders rejected or ignored these veterans, Butler's loyalty and compassion shined through. His popularity among veterans made him uniquely influential, especially to those looking for someone who could lead a mass movement. It was precisely this influence that drew attention from shadowy figures plotting in the background. In 1933, Butler found himself quietly approached by representatives of a powerful but secretive group, men like Gerald McGuire, a smooth-talking Wall Street bond broker, and Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer's sewing machine fortune. These were no ordinary men. They were connected, influential, and wealthy beyond imagination, and deeply troubled by Roosevelt's presidency. In clandestine meetings, they made Butler a staggering proposal. They laid out plans to rally hundreds of thousands of disgruntled war veterans into a formidable private army. With Butler at its head, this force would march on Washington, seize control, and effectively sideline President Roosevelt, reducing him to nothing but a powerless puppet figurehead. Butler, they assured him, would hold real power, a kind of shadow president, able to guide America back to sound principles, away from what they reviewed as Roosevelt's dangerous socialism. They promised Butler personal rewards as well, financial security, his family's future secured, and power that few men had ever wielded. Butler listened, absorbing every astonishing detail, weighing the enormity of what was being proposed. Now, one critical question hung in the air. Would this revered military leader, this trusted advocate for America's veterans, truly consider accepting such an audacious offer? Could Butler, a man celebrated for integrity, really become the face of America's darkest conspiracy? As America's future teetered on the edge, the answer to that question would soon determine the fate of democracy itself. In late summer 1933, Gerald McGuire and Robert Sterling Clark grew increasingly open with General Butler. Sensing they had found their ideal figurehead, now the conversation shifted dramatically, revealing a highly organized and deeply funded conspiracy far beyond anything Butler had imagined. McGuire returned from a trip to Europe, energized and confident. He explained to Butler that he'd studied emerging fascist movements overseas, including Mussolini's Italy and veteran-based militias in France. With unsettling enthusiasm, he described how these political groups seized political power quickly and effectively, leveraging the discipline and grievances of war veterans to reshape entire nations. This, McGuire claimed, was precisely the model America's richest men intended to follow. He laid out the specifics of the plan: the creation of an organized private army numbering as many as 500,000 veterans. This force, under Butler's respected leadership, would march into Washington, not as a ragtag protest, but as a disciplined demonstration of power. The plot's orchestrators weren't aiming for violence. McGuire assured Butler, not explicitly. Instead, the sheer show of force would compel Roosevelt into political submission. Roosevelt would remain president in name, to a comforting facade reassuring the American public, but the real governing authority would be transferred to Butler, who would hold the newly created title Secretary of General Affairs. The actual strings of power, however, would extend back to McGuire's wealthy backers, invisible to the public, but fully in control. Butler pressed McGuire for clarity. Was he truly suggesting Roosevelt be reduced to a mere puppet? McGuire answered calmly, stating simply that Roosevelt could be allowed to maintain the illusion of leadership so long as he cooperated. The press would easily be convinced to play along, perhaps by circulating rumors that Roosevelt's health was failing, or that he had become overwhelmed by the weight of the presidency. The plot was chillingly comprehensive. McGuire explained that tens of millions of dollars had already been pledged, funds sufficient not only to mobilize the veterans, but also to buy the silence or cooperation of key figures in government, law enforcement, and even the media. The conspirators, McGuire hinted, had cultivated deep relationships in those critical sectors, ensuring that resistance would be swiftly neutralized or publicly discredited. For Butler, What was most troubling wasn't just the sheer audacity of the plan. It was McGuire's calm conviction. To him and the men he represented, this conspiracy wasn't madness, it was merely business. America, they believed, was a company in crisis, and they were shareholders stepping in to remove ineffective management. Butler realized he was facing a scenario more sinister and calculated than he'd initially suspected. The plotters were patient, strategic, and determined, and he understood clearly they saw him as the perfect instrument to accomplish their audacious scheme. Now Butler had to make an impossible decision. Would he confront some of America's most powerful and ruthless men head on, or become complicit in the greatest betrayal in American democracy?
Trust. It's hard to get and easy to lose. When the risk of loss is great and people are hurting, who do you trust? How about the people trusted by the biggest names in business, agriculture, and government? Atlanta's Private Investigations, building trust one case at a time.
I'm Michael, founder of Atlanta's Private Investigations. Let's talk. When you need help, your answers are here. As the plot unfolded, one question loomed largest for General Butler. Who exactly stood behind this audacious scheme? Slowly, Gerald McGuire began to drop the veil of secrecy, naming the powerful figures quietly backing this unprecedented conspiracy. First was Robert Sterling Clark, heir to the Singer's sewing machine fortune. Now, Clark was a man accustomed to enormous privilege and influence, and deeply worried about Roosevelt's economic reforms. He viewed the president's abandonment of the gold standard as a catastrophe. He believed it would wipe out private wealth, including his own. Clark had already spent thousands lobbying for a return to the gold standard, and now was preparing to fund something more radical. Then there was Grayson P. Murphy, a Wall Street giant, director of a powerful investment firm, a key figure behind the scenes. Murphy's influence was vast. He had personally financed the founding of the American Legion years before and remained deeply involved with veterans affairs. His extensive financial network and political clout made him an ideal architect for a plan that required secrecy, resources, and careful coordination. But perhaps the most shocking were the whispered connections to J.P. Morgan Jr., heir to America's greatest banking dynasty, and Irene DuPont, head of the power DuPont chemical empire. Morgan Jr. represented more than just wealth. He symbolized Wall Street itself. His bank controlled vast swaths of the American economy, from railroads to manufacturing, and wielded extraordinary political leverage. Though Morgan himself carefully remained out of direct view, associates and allies within his orbit were implicated by McGuire as instrumental in providing financing and logistical support. The DuPont family, owners of General Motors and Remington Arms, stood to benefit enormously if Roosevelt's expansive federal programs and financial reforms were halted. DuPont openly criticized Roosevelt's administration as a socialist threat. The involvement of such an influential industrial titan hinted at something beyond political disagreement. This was an orchestrated attempt by America's richest families to ensure their continued dominance. And yet, the names didn't stop there. Behind the scenes, there were references to other prominent figures from America's corporate and financial elite, men who together controlled assets worth billions. Many would later join a newly formed organization, the American Liberty League, whose stated aim was to defend property rights and constitutional government against Roosevelt's New Deal policy. Butler quickly recognized this organization for what it was, a public front for private dissent, potentially providing political cover for the conspirators. With each new name revealed, the staggering scope of this conspiracy came into sharper focus. Butler began to understand that this plot was not the isolated work of a handful of disgruntled individuals. It was a coordinated, carefully considered attempt by some of America's most powerful and influential leaders to overturn democracy itself, preserving their immense wealth and influence at all costs. The gravity of what Butler faced became undeniable. He wasn't dealing merely with rogue idealists or isolated radicals. He stood against men who wielded almost unimaginable power, men whose resources, connections, and ambition made them capable of reshaping history itself. Now, General Butler was forced to confront the unsettling question: could he possibly challenge such power? And if he did, what price might he pay? General Smedley Butler stood at an agonizing crossroads. Before him lay the starkest choice of his lifetime: silence and complicity, or courage and confrontation. The scale of what he had uncovered was breathtaking. The conspirators were men of immense influence and wealth, willing to reshape American democracy to serve their own ends. Butler understood the enormous risk of opposing him, not just to himself, but to his family as well. Yet silence would mean betrayal. Betrayal of his oath, of democracy, and most importantly, of the veterans who trusted him implicitly. The thought tormented Butler. Could he really allow himself to become the figurehead of America's greatest political crime? Well, his decision came quickly. Butler knew precisely what he had to do, regardless of the personal cost. But he also knew that confronting such formidable opponents required proof, undeniable evidence that would withstand scrutiny and skepticism. Quietly, methodically, Butler documented every conversation, meeting, and detail shared by McGuire and his accomplices. He gathered testimony, correspondence, and banking records, building an unassailable case to reveal the plot in stunning clarity. And when the moment finally arrived, Butler chose to go public. In November 1934, he approached the McCormick-Dixon Congressional Committee, tasked with investigating un-American activities, and laid out the entire conspiracy in shocking detail. Under oath, Butler recounted the secret meetings, the names of powerful men, the plans for a massive private army of disgruntled veterans, and the plot to reduce President Roosevelt to a mere puppet leader. Initially, Butler's revelations were met with disbelief. The media acted swiftly and harshly. Some newspapers even branded his claims as a gigantic hoax, accusing Butler of sensationalism. The accused conspirators quickly denied involvement. Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan called the entire affair perfect moonshine, dismissing it outright. America struggled to comprehend the very notion that its most revered institutions and elite figures could consider such a treasonous act. But the skeptics were soon silenced by mounting evidence. Investigators confirmed critical aspects of Butler's testimony, uncovering financial transactions and correspondence that matched his claims. Gerald McGuire himself was questioned, offering contradictory and evasive answers that only deepened the suspicion. Congressional committee investigators quietly acknowledged that they had discovered a genuine effort to establish a fascist-style government, just as Butler had warned. Yet strangely, despite compelling proof, the investigation never fully pursued the wealthy backers. Powerful names implicated by Butler remained untouched, never summoned before Congress, never publicly held accountable. Rumors swirled about secret arrangements behind closed doors. Speculation that Roosevelt's administration quietly buried the investigation to avoid national turmoil during a vulnerable moment in American history. Though frustrated and angered by incomplete justice, Butler's exposure of the plot permanently damaged its viability. He had single-handedly disrupted one of the most audacious conspiracies in American history, not with force, but with truth and with courage. General Smedley Butler had chosen patriotism over power, integrity over convenience, but his efforts raised haunting questions that linger to this day. Could such powerful forces threaten democracy again? And would another leader have Butler's strength to stand against them?
Hi, thanks for coming to Kara's Corner. If you remember the 2000s tabloids, the chaos of U.S. Weekly, the National Enquirer, or Page 6, then you already know what media power looks like when it's messy, biased, and way too personal. But imagine that times 100. Because in the 1930s, one man owned the media. And when America was on the edge of collapse, he didn't just stir the drama. He nearly helped end democracy. His name? William Randolph Hearst. By the 1930s, William Randolph Hearst was running a media empire so massive it made modern tabloids look like school newsletters. He controlled 26 daily newspapers, Sunday editions, magazines, radio stations, and even his own movie studio. You couldn't escape his influence. At first, Hearst supported Franklin D. Roosevelt, hoping he'd take the bold action to protect America against business interests during the Depression. But when the New Deal started prioritizing workers, unions, and poor over the wealthy elite, Hearst turned hard against him and used his media machine to go to war with the president. He called Roosevelt's government more communistic than communists. Then he used his newspapers to flood the country with anti-New Deal propaganda, red baiting, and glowing coverage of fascist regimes. And yes, he even paid Hitler and Mussolini to publish op-eds in his newspaper. You heard that right. He paid actual Nazis to spread their message in America. And when union workers went on strike in California, Hearst papers called them communist threats and cheered on the mobs that came to fight them. The message was clear. If you don't like the system, then you're the enemy. Now here's where it gets wild. In 1933, a group of millionaires tried to convince war hero General Smedley Butler to lead a fascist coup against the president. Butler said the plotters told him, "We've got all the newspapers, and we'll make it look like Roosevelt's health is failing. The dumb American people will fall for it." They didn't say Hearst by name, but everyone knew who ran the headlines. This was the same man who published Hitler, met with Mussolini, fired reporters who exposed fascism, and told America that fascism might be necessary to stop socialism. He wasn't officially in the plot, but he didn't have to be. He made the plot believable. In the end, the coup failed. But the press stayed powerful. And Hearst, he never faced any consequences. He covered it all up with patriotism while feeding people propaganda. The real danger wasn't hiding. It was right there on the front page. And when the story gets told, don't forget who helped write the script. Thanks for coming to Kara's Corner, and I'll see you next time.
Well, sure, I remember it like it was yesterday. I was going through a devastating divorce. That's hard already. Then my ex hid our money and tried to take the kids from me. My attorney suggested I call Atlanta's Private Investigations. That was the turning point. Michael and his team got me the proof I needed to get my children back and secure our future.
I'm Michael from Atlanta's Private Investigations. Let's talk. When you need help, your answers are here. In the end, despite overwhelming evidence, no one faced prosecution for the business plot. America's most powerful men walked away untouched, their reputations preserved, shielded by wealth and influence. General Smedley Butler's courageous stand ensured the conspiracy never materialized. But soon afterwards, it faded quietly from history, overshadowed by the turmoil of subsequent decades. Why was such an audacious scheme quickly buried? Historians suggest secret agreements may have been struck behind closed doors, and perhaps Roosevelt, facing the enormous pressures of the Depression, chose stability over confrontation. Or perhaps those implicated were simply too influential, too powerful to hold accountable openly. Yet the lessons of the business plot remain deeply relevant and unsettling. Democracy is not invincible. Its greatest threats aren't always obvious. They often arise quietly from within, masked by positions of trust and authority. We saw echoes of this warning recently, during the Biden administration, when serious allegations emerged suggesting the president had become little more than a figurehead, overshadowed, subtly manipulated by unelected bureaucrats within the White House itself. Critics claim that it wasn't powerful industrials pulling the strings this time, but government insiders quietly shaping policy and controlling decisions behind closed doors. These allegations, like the plot against Roosevelt, shook public trust, prompting Americans again to question who truly holds power in our democracy. If unelected insiders can quietly dominate a presidency, what does this say about the state of American democracy today? General Butler's courageous stand reminds us that democracy demands constant vigilance. He understood clearly that silence is complicity, and that true power comes from integrity and transparency, not secrecy and manipulation. Tonight, reflecting on both the business plot and recent controversies, we must ask ourselves honestly, are we paying attention? Do we recognize democracy's fragility? Butler's warning still resonates. Democracy doesn't protect itself. It depends on citizens willing to defend it. And perhaps the greatest safeguard we have is the courage to see clearly, question openly, and hold power accountable, no matter who wields it. I'm Michael Braa, and this is The Michael Braa Show. Good night.